again, it doesn't take much for this to happen. All it takes is, again, the right set of properties, the person's own immune system, and it causes this horrendous looking rash, which is very uncomfortable. You need to be put on antifungal medication and a variety of other medications, and it can become very dangerous. So if you come into presence of something that looks like mold, use a general rule of thumb, okay, it might be mold, but I gotta get it tested, and I'm not touching it or going near it until it's done. So the three most common molds that we find here in particular is Penicillium aspergillus, which is very common, Stachybotrys, which is black mold, and Fusarium. These are the three most common types of mold that we will find in our environments here in Canada, and they're also the most toxic. So aspergillus is common indoor and outdoor environments, and it could cause some serious infections, and some species actually do produce carcinogens as well. Aspergillus can affect the organs such as nails, eyes, heart, lungs, liver, and kidneys. Again, this is where aspergillosis of the lungs comes from. And its color does vary, as with every species of mold. That's important to know. Just because it's black does not mean it's black mold. For example, black mold is commonly found in plant, debris, soil, as well as in high moisture areas. It can go from black to green in color, slimy and shiny. But when it becomes dry, it becomes gray and powdery. Right? So if you come across mold that's gray and powdery, it may very well be black mold. So it has some very interesting properties. Now, based on what we learned, if it's gray and dried out, does that mean that the mold is dead?
Mm-hmm.
No, right? Dormant, if you will. Yeah, that's the best way of putting it, dormant. And it's in the process of finding a mate. Best way of putting it, right? This is an example of an extremely saturated home with black mold. Now,
Can you fix that?
Work.
yeah,
Without gutting the place?
Burn it.
you gotta gut the place in a situation like this. In fact, we find that removal of black mold is the best solution, which is not something that a lot of people want to hear a lot of times. So they want to disinfect and save as much money as possible.
Sarnia.
Oh, yes.
So the interesting thing with mold is that we have to follow specific guidelines. And if you go on our website, you'll see the guidelines that we need to follow. But for example, what we need to do in a contaminated area, removing the drywall, for example, is of the contaminated area, you got to remove a perimeter of 6 feet around. And then once that perimeter is removed, you do a further inspection. Detect any other mold, guess what? Another 6 feet around. So it can become fairly costly, but without proper testing, you won't really know if what you got is in fact black mold or something else that could be present. What I find interesting about this picture in particular is that notice how, you know, the entire, first of all the walls are completely saturated, but you can also see growing on the sofas and everywhere else. So it starts to latch on, and how does it go from here to here? Very easily. Airborne microscopic spores.
Would it go into wood studs?
Yes, absolutely.
In that case, how would you remedy the situation? You take all the drywall out, and then there's still a stud, and that's a load-bearing thing.
Mm-hmm. There are different methods. Sometimes replacing the studs altogether, sometimes using disinfectants depending on the type of mold and species, dry blasting techniques, other things along those lines that may be helpful in removing it. So every situation is inherently unique and very different, and it really does depend on the species, and it also depends on what the client is willing to kind of spend.
I guess the big question, if you run into a place like that, believe it or not, I've seen one similar to that. How much does it cost?
It depends. I can't really give an estimate. And that's something that we hate doing over the phone a lot. People call us, I got this problem, how much is it going to cost?
You better know what mold
We need to know what type of mold it is first, because that'll determine our approach, that'll determine what disinfectants we'll use, what methods we'll use, and also for dealing with black mold, which is a toxigenic mold, well, we have a whole set of different, guidelines and standards that we use as opposed to, another common household mold that, could just maybe require some simple disinfection. So all of those things are very individualized.
I was just wondering, because I mean, in what we do,
Mm-hmm.
buy a place like that, it's a gold mine. You can get it done for 30 or 40,000.
Exactly.
You can really submarine, but I wouldn't know where to begin and on a cost of that.
Mm-hmm.
We saw a place, I think, remember that one down
And in fact,
Brutal.
homes like this or situations, like, I mean, this is pretty bad. Like, I mean, I must admit,
How long would it take to get to that state?
it couldn't take long at all, maybe 2-3 months, a month even. Picture this family, this old retired couple, leaving in the winter time, for example, to go to Florida, coming back and this is what they find. Or leaving their cottage, for the season and then coming back and this is what they would find. It doesn't take much. Keep in mind that mold doesn't take long to grow, and given the right set of properties, it can germinate really quickly.
So what caused all this?
This particular problem, lack of ventilation, moisture problems, humidity levels, things along those lines. Didn't take much. The materials were already contaminated to begin with, so just the growth process happened really quickly. Now, when we find a situation like this, I know this is pretty extreme and intense, but in grow ops, you will find the most kind of the craziest, if you will, because it factors in all of those different factors, right? So high levels of humidity, water, poor ventilation, because they gotta, root everything out through a pipe, a secret pipe through the basement, So all those factors contribute to having the worst possible conditions, and so it can become very, very dangerous and very costly in the interim of fixing it. Yes, sir.
You talk about the testing for mold. In terms of test, is it on-site test, or you need to take some sample back to your office for testing? How long does it normally take?
We always have to take, if we're taking samples and tests, we always need to send them to a laboratory. And so we do this for a number of reasons. One is that it's out of our hands, for one, right? We're not involved in testing and tampering of the test, which is, again, we saw that video, right? All those guys were there to make money as quick as possible, right? So they automatically just said, nope, yeah, this is what it is. For us, we want to make sure 100%, so we use a third-party certified laboratory. They do a comprehensive analysis of our samples. They produce a lab report, which we had no part in whatsoever, and then based on those results, we're able to provide our recommendations. So there are different tests that we could do. We could do, and we saw this on the video very briefly, a guy held 2 jars and he shook them a little bit, he's like, oh no, this doesn't appear to be mold here. That's called a swab test. That's essentially like a pregnancy test, yes or no. I mean, we could do that, anyone could do that, pick up a home kit, right? Yes or no.
Do you do that, or don't?
At times, a lot of times we don't need to, because yes or no doesn't tell us anything other than what we already know. We've been in business so long now, we probably have a general, pretty good idea if it is or if it's not, but you need to get the proper testing done to know its species. Once you know its species and its property and its level of pathogenic issues, then you're able to properly treat the problem. And that's what people want. People want the problem gone. They don't necessarily care if it's, one type of mold or the other. They just want to know, how can you get rid of it and how cheap can you do it? So the best way to giving people the cheapest price is by getting the most accurate information about the problem.
Another thing would be time frame. How long are we looking at here? A
Mhm.
week, 2 weeks?
No, not even that much. With us, we do anywhere from 2 to 4 business days.
Okay.
Pretty quick.
So from the time of diagnosis to the time you can clean it up and,
Within a week, the whole thing.
Okay.
That's
as long as it's not like that last house.
even then, that's maybe a 2-3 day job. We'll take it. That's so. Who's at risk? Well, the people who are most at risk from mold exposure are people with compromised immune systems. So people, for example, who are undergoing chemotherapy, or people who are just ill, have illnesses in their own life. Infants, elderly, and the asthmatics. These are the people who are most prone to sicknesses caused and problems caused by mold. But you don't just need to be in these categories to be affected by mold. Keep that in mind. Even the healthiest, most spry individual like myself could be infected with mold, no problem. So I mentioned earlier that we do indoor air quality testing to detect non-visible mold. So indoor air quality is the quality of air in and around buildings and structures. Did you know that we as Canadians, we spend about 90% of our time indoors? So from office to home. So that tells me that it's very important that the air that we're breathing is healthy and safe. For myself, for you, for our families. So when we're looking at indoor air quality, we need to look at a couple things. First of all, there are biological contaminants like mold and bacteria and dust that float around in the air. And there are chemical contaminants like gases and particles, produced by appliances and various building materials, personal care products like cologne and that kind of stuff produces these gases, household cleaners, insulation, like oldest insulation like asbestos and things along those lines. These are things that we look at. Some other biological contaminants that are common are VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which I'm sure everyone here has learned about at one point. Pollen, bacteria, viruses, and another big one, insects or rodents, fecal matter and urine, which is something that we are discovering more and more a lot now, is that we walk into a home that has that strong, distinct smell. It smells like mold, feels like mold, there are health problems associated with it. We do testing, we find out that it's not mold, but in fact there's maybe a colony of mice, I don't know if it's a colony, but anyways, a colony of mice behind a wall that have decided to use a particular area as their bathroom. And that's even more toxic a lot of times than most of the mold that we would find here in Ottawa, or in Ontario, I should say. So naturally, why is indoor air quality so important? Well, we're indoors 90% of the time, so it's very important that the air we breathe in is healthy. But it's also been linked to something called sick building syndrome, which has been something that's been occurring more often in offices. And it's a combination of symptoms thought to be caused by the environments in which a person lives or works. So they are sick as a result of what they're living in. Earlier when I mentioned that apartment in Montreal and the woman who was sick, whenever she was out of the apartment, she was fine. Whenever she was in the apartment, she got ill. Sick building syndrome. Yeah, these guys used to be part of our team, but they moved on to bigger, better things. Now, we, certainly what sets us apart from other companies, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that we use specific professional equipment when doing testing and remediation. So we're not just walking around with my Android flashlight and a hope and a prayer. We actually got some pretty awesome stuff. The first thing, naturally, this is every mold inspector should have this, is a thermal imaging camera. I spent some time discussing that earlier, what that does. It helps us to determine differences in temperature behind walls and in structures, which is great at helping us know if there's a leak or something along those lines. A particle counter, which is something that we use to determine just the particle count in a room. So basically what that does is it helps us to know if the air, without doing any testing, has heavier or more matter floating around than normal. So the average room, or what would be considered to be healthy, is 250,000 particles, right? Now, when we test, and I'll pull this out right now, we'll test how many particles are in this particular room. So what seems to be acceptable or healthy for most average places is 250,000 particles.
Oh, we're good.
Hold on, it's going to refresh every 6 seconds.
Oh, wait a minute, is that 1 million?
Wait,
Is that 167,000 or 1.6 million?
So what's it at now? Okay, so we're doing pretty good. All right, so all things considering, the indoor air here is pretty awesome. Now, in hospitals, the ideal particle count, guess what it is?
100,000.
0.
Come on.
Sterile,
Yeah.
right? So when we go into a home and we do a particle count, for example, geez, I could be dangerous. We do a particle count and we see that it's over 250,000. And we've done some in homes that are like astronomical amounts. Then we know, without even having to do testing, that there's a problem in the air. Something much more than what should be floating around is there. And that gives us a good indication as to what to test for. So we use a particle counter for that primarily, to know very quickly what the air is like without really knowing why the air is like that. A moisture meter actually looks something kind of like this, in fact. And you'll see people do this, and basically what it does is that it detects moisture behind walls. So you could put it up against the wall, and then as soon as there's a moisture, it'll start to beep. Right? So it's a good way of knowing on a superficial level what type of moisture may be hidden back there. So when we do visual inspections, we use these things to give us an idea of what we can't see, the things that are beyond our own scope. There are two different types of moisture meters, by the way. There's the invasive, which is actually, puncturing a hole through the wall, it's like tiny, like pin size almost, putting it through, detect it, and surface, which is what I just did with this thing over here, right? The other interesting tool that we use, and this is particularly great when removing it or preventing mold to begin with, is using Hepa Filtration, which stands for High Efficiency Particulate Arrestants. And it removes particles greater than 1 micron, so any particle that is greater than 1